My name is Anne Voss. I'm 31. 8 months ago, I discovered that my parents had secretly adopted a child when I was 11 years old. Not a baby. A 6-year-old girl named Lily. They raised her in a house 40 minutes from mine, in a life that ran parallel to ours for 20 years, funded in significant part by money redirected from a college savings account that had my name on it. I found out because of a hospital form. A routine emergency contact update at my dentist's office, of all places, where the receptionist handed me a tablet and I filled in my parents' names and then, without thinking, typed in siblings and paused because something in the form asked for their contact information too, and I typed none and then thought about it for half a second too long and looked it up out of idle curiosity and found a name I had never heard attached to my parents' address from 12 years ago. Lily Anne Voss. I stared at that name on my phone screen for what felt like a long time. It was probably 40 seconds. Then I called my mother. She didn't answer. I called my father. He picked up on the third ring, and I said, "Dad, who is Lily Anne Voss?" And the silence that followed that question told me everything before he said a single word. Before I tell you what he said, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is already pulling at something real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I need to start with what my childhood looked like from the inside, because the thing about a secret is that it doesn't feel like a secret when you're living inside it. It just feels like life, the particular shape of your family, the specific texture of your specific normal. You don't know what's missing because you don't know how to look for it. You only understand the shape of the gap when someone finally hands you the piece that was supposed to fill it. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, a mid-sized town in the kind of county where everyone knows the name of the family that owns the grain elevator, and the hardware store has been run by the same people for 3 generations. My father, Robert Voss, was an accountant. My mother, Carol, taught piano lessons out of the house on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. We were comfortable, not wealthy, but the kind of stability that comes from 2 careful people who made sensible decisions and didn't spend beyond what they had. We had a house with a yard. We took vacations to the same lake cabin in Michigan every July. I had bike and piano lessons and a savings account my parents started for me when I was born, which they called Serena's Future, which they referenced with a particular warmth that made it feel both promised and personal. I was an only child. Or I believed I was. I had no reason not to believe it. There were no slip-ups, no whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, no photographs I wasn't supposed to see, no relatives who looked at me with a particular complicated expression when my parents weren't watching. There was simply my family, my mother, my father, and I, our triangle, our kitchen table, our Michigan Julys, our life. When I was 11, things shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Nothing my 11-year-old self registered as significant. My parents seemed more tired than usual. My mother was on the phone more often, in her bedroom with the door partly closed, which was unusual. My father worked late several times a week for a stretch of about 4 months, which he had not done before with any regularity. There were 2 trips they took without me, which they said were for work, leaving me with my grandmother for a long weekend each time. I remember being mildly annoyed about missing a birthday party for a friend during one of those weekends. I remember my grandmother making French toast and letting me stay up to watch a movie I wasn't quite old enough for. I remember nothing else unusual about those months because there was nothing unusual to observe. Just 2 tired parents and some extra phone calls, and the sense that adults had things going on that were not relevant to my life as an 11-year-old in Ohio. Then it settled. The tiredness lifted. The late nights ended. The phone calls became ordinary again, and life continued its familiar shape. Piano lessons, savings account, Michigan in July. My triangle. My normal. I was a good student. This is relevant because it connects directly to the money, which is the part of this story I need you to understand before I tell you what happened when I was 31. I was the kind of student who read ahead in the textbook without being asked and stayed after class to ask the teacher questions that weren't on the test and spent weekends at the library. Not because I had homework due, but because I was curious about something, and the library was where curiosity went in a town without much else to offer it. I graduated third in my class. I won a regional mathematics competition when I was 16. I was accepted to 4 universities, including a strong engineering program 3 states away that offered me a partial scholarship and the possibility, if I maintained my grades, of a full academic scholarship by my second year. My parents sat me down in the spring of my senior year and told me about Serena's future. The savings account. They said it had grown over the years, that they were proud of what they'd set aside, and that it would cover my first year of tuition, room, and board, and give me a cushion for books and expenses. After that, they said, I would need to manage with the partial scholarship and whatever I could earn through work study. It was not everything I'd hoped for, but it was solid ground to start from, and I was grateful for it, and I said so. I went to university. I worked. I maintained my scholarship. I graduated in 4 years with a degree in mechanical engineering and no debt, which I understood at the time as a near miracle and attributed entirely to my own discipline, the partial scholarship, and the start my parents had given me from the savings account. I got a job at an infrastructure consulting firm. I was good at it. I got promoted twice in 5 years. I moved to a city 2 states away. I built a life that was mine, built from the inside out, the way I had always built things, carefully, with attention to the structure underneath. My relationship with my parents was warm but geographically distant. Monthly calls, holiday visits, the occasional long weekend when someone's schedule aligned. My mother sent cards for my birthday with handwritten notes that were genuinely sweet. My father and I talked about engineering projects and local politics in Ohio State's football season with the comfortable ease of 2 people who like each other and have run out of deep things to say. I did not feel unloved by my parents. I want to be clear about that. I felt. And this is the word I keep coming back to. Managed. Not in a sinister way. In the way that careful, private people manage the people they love when they are carrying something they don't know how to share. I was 31 on the day I found out. It was a Thursday in October. I was at my dentist for a routine cleaning. The office had updated its record system, and the receptionist handed me a tablet and asked me to verify my emergency contacts. I updated my parents' phone numbers, which had changed. And then there was a field for siblings. I paused. The field was optional. I almost skipped it, but something made me look it up. Not out of suspicion, just out of a vague sense that I should be thorough, that I should fill in the form correctly. I opened a family search on my phone, the kind of public records aggregator you find in 30 seconds on any browser, typed in Voss, Ohio, my parents' names, and scrolled through the results looking for anything relevant. And there it was. In a property record from 12 years ago, an address I recognized as my parents' house before they downsized. Listed as residents: Robert Voss, Carol Voss, Serena Voss, Lily Anne Voss. I read it 3 times. Lily Anne Voss, my parents' address, my parents' last name. A name I had never heard in 31 years of being their daughter. I put my phone in my pocket. I went through the cleaning. I drove home. I sat in my car in my parking garage for several minutes without moving. And then I called my mother. She didn't answer. I called my father. He picked up on the 3rd ring. He said hello in the voice he uses when he can see it's me and is genuinely glad I called. I said, Dad, who is Lily Ann Voss? The silence that followed was 12 seconds long. I counted them. Not in the moment. I couldn't have counted anything in that moment. But I replayed the recording afterward because I had accidentally started a voice memo on my phone when I called him, and I played it back that evening in my apartment, and I counted 12 seconds of my father not speaking, which for Robert Voss, who is never at a loss for something measured to say, was 12 seconds of the most articulate silence I have ever heard. Then he said, Serena, I think we need to have a conversation in person. I said, I think you need to tell me right now who that is. Another pause, shorter this time. Then he said, "She's your sister." I pulled into my building's parking space and sat there with the engine off and the phone against my ear and the word sister hanging in the air of my car like something solid. I said, "I have a sister." He said, "Yes." I said, "Since when?" He said, "Since you were 11. I drove back to Ohio that weekend. 8 hours. I did not tell my parents I was coming until I was 2 hours away. I didn't trust myself to have the conversation on the phone, and I didn't trust them to have it either. Some conversations need a room. They need eye contact, the inability to press end call, and the particular accountability that comes from being physically present with the people you are asking to tell you the truth. My mother opened the door when I arrived. She had clearly been crying, or been close to crying, for some time. Her eyes had the specific look of someone who has been bracing for impact and has now watched it arrive. My father was standing at the kitchen table, his hands in his pockets, upright, and still the way he goes when something is serious, and he has prepared himself to hold it. I sat down. I did not hug them when I came in, which was not intentional. It was just what happened. My body knew something my words hadn't said yet. I said, "Tell me everything. From the beginning." And they did. Across 2 hours at the kitchen table where I had grown up, my parents told me a story that had been running parallel to mine for 20 years. When I was 11, my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Patricia, died. Suddenly, from a cardiac event at 42 years old. She left behind a 6-year-old daughter, a little girl named Lily, whose father had not been in the picture since Lily was 3, and whose whereabouts at the time of Patricia's death were unknown. My parents were the only family available. The alternative was foster care. They made a decision in a weekend, in the particular compressed urgency of a family crisis where the available options are limited and the stakes are a child's life, and they said yes. They took Lily. They went through the formal adoption process over the following months, and they made another decision, one that they described to me across that kitchen table with the particular careful tone of two people who have rehearsed an explanation many times without ever finding the version that fully works. They decided not to tell me. I said, "Why?" My mother said, "You were 11. We didn't know how to explain it. We didn't want you to feel replaced or displaced or that your place in our family had changed." I said, "So you decided instead that Lily's existence would change my place in the family without me knowing it was happening." My father said, "We thought it would be temporary. We thought we'd find a way to integrate it gradually. Introduce the idea slowly." I said, "She's 26. 20 years is not gradually. 20 years is a choice." Neither of them said anything to that. I said, "Where does she live?" My mother said, "Columbus. She's a teacher." I said, "Does she know about me?" My father said, "Yes." I said, "For how long?" He said, "She's always known. We told her about you from the beginning. We explained that you were older and that the situation was complicated and that we were going to find the right time." I said, "You told her about me, but you didn't tell me about her." My mother reached across the table. I moved my hands to my lap. I said, "I want to understand the money." My father's expression shifted. Something careful moved across his face. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Serena's future. The savings account. You told me it had grown over the years, that you were proud of what you'd set aside. When I was 18, it covered my first year. Then it was gone. I understood that. I was grateful for it. But I want to understand what happened to the account over the years between when it was started and when I turned 18. My mother said, "Serena." I said, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just want to understand." My father said, "We used some of it. When Lily came, there were costs. Legal fees for the adoption. Childcare adjustments. We had to make some financial decisions quickly, and the account was accessible." I said, "How much?" He said, "I'd have to look at the records." I said, "Approximately." He looked at the table. He said, "Probably around 40,000 over the course of the years. We rebuilt some of it before you went to university. But not all of it. $40,000 from a savings account with my name on it, redirected to fund the adoption and early care of a child whose existence I didn't know about, whose name I had never heard." While I worked 2 jobs during university to cover what the scholarship didn't reach. While I ate rice and frozen vegetables 4 nights a week in a dorm room and told myself that was just what independence looked like, I said, "Okay." My father said, "Serena, we did the best we could in an impossible situation." I said, "I believe you. And I also think the best you could have done was tell me." I was 11, not 4. I was old enough to understand that a little girl needed a family, and you were going to provide one. I would have understood that. I might have even been glad. My mother started to cry. My father put his hand on her shoulder and looked at me with something that was not quite guilt and not quite defensiveness. The look of a person who has justified something for so long that the justification has become structural, load-bearing, impossible to remove without the whole thing coming down. I stayed the night. In my old room, which had not substantially changed since I left for university, which was its own kind of strangeness now, the preserved and amber quality of a room that had been kept as I left it, while 20 feet down the hall, another life had apparently been in motion. I lay on my old bed, looked at the ceiling, and thought about Lily. Not abstractly, specifically. She was 26 years old. She taught school somewhere in Columbus. She was the daughter of my mother's sister, which made her my cousin by blood, my sister by adoption. She had known about me for 20 years. She had grown up knowing she had an older sister somewhere who didn't know she existed. I tried to imagine what that felt like and found I couldn't. The shape of it was too unfamiliar. I thought about the parallel lives. Mine and hers running alongside each other in the same family without ever intersecting, separated by a decision 2 people made across a kitchen table when I was 11 years old and she was 6, and neither of us had any say in what happened next. I thought about the $40,000, the savings account with my name on it, Serena's future. I thought about the scholarship applications I had written with the specific anxiety of someone who understood that the margin between enough and not enough was narrow. The work-study hours, the rice and the frozen vegetables, the particular discipline of building a life from resources that were thinner than I had been told to expect. I had built something real from those years. I was not sorry for the discipline or the work or what it had made of me, but I was allowed to know what it had actually cost. I was allowed to look at the gap between what I had been given and what I had been told I was given. Those were not the same number, and I was allowed to know that. In the morning, I had coffee with my parents. The 3 of us at the kitchen table, the way it had always been, except now the kitchen table felt different. Not hostile, just reconfigured. The floor plan was the same, and the furniture was the same, and the coffee was the same, and we were not the same. I said, "I want to meet her." My mother looked up. I said, "Lily, I want to meet her. She's my sister. She's been my sister for 20 years. I don't want to lose more time." My father said, "She wants to meet you, too." "She has for a long time," I said. "Then let's arrange it." My mother began to cry again. This time, I reached across the table. Not to comfort exactly, just to be present. There is a difference between those 2 things, and I was learning it in real time. I want to stop here for a moment because I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking I should be angrier, that the appropriate response to 20 years of a hidden sibling and $40,000 redirected from my savings account is fury, confrontation, and a reckoning that matches the size of the concealment. And I understand that impulse. I sat with versions of that fury for days after I drove back to my apartment. I felt it at 2 in the morning when the full weight of it landed, the 20 years of kitchen tables for 3 when there were 4 of us, the scholarship applications written in the dark, the university years calculated against a number that had been quietly reduced. I felt it fully, and I did not rush past it. But I also held something else alongside it. My parents made a decision in a crisis that was not about me. They were trying to save a child. They were doing something genuinely good in impossible circumstances. And then they made a second, worse decision to keep it from me, which compounded over 20 years into something much larger than it needed to be. Those two things are both true, and neither of them erases the other. I have spent enough time in my adult life with complicated structures. I work in infrastructure. The entire job is understanding how systems behave under load, to know that most failures are not caused by malice. They are caused by a decision made under pressure that was never revisited when the pressure eased. My parents made that decision when I was 11, and then they lived inside it for 20 years without finding a way back out. That is not a villainous act. It is a human one. And human acts require human responses, not theatrical ones. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what happened next in the right context. I did not forgive instantly. I did not pretend that the 20 years were acceptable. I did not fold the whole thing into a comfortable narrative about family and grace and moving forward. I held all of it, the concealment, the money, the lost time. And I also moved forward. Those things coexisted. They still do. I met Lily on a Saturday in November, 4 weeks after the dentist appointment that changed everything. We met at a coffee shop in Columbus that she suggested, a small, independent place on a neighborhood street that felt deliberately neutral, a public space with enough ambient noise to make silences less heavy and enough privacy for a real conversation. I arrived first. I ordered a coffee, sat at a corner table, and looked at the door. I didn't know what she looked like. My parents had offered to show me photos, and I had said not yet. I wanted to see her the way you see someone for the first time, without preparation. I wanted the real moment, unmediated. She walked in at exactly the time we'd arranged, which told me something about her right away. She was tall, taller than I expected, with my mother's coloring in a way that caught me off guard because, of course, she didn't have my mother's coloring. She had her own mother's coloring. But there was something in the set of her jaw that was familiar in a way I couldn't immediately explain. She scanned the room and found me the same way I'd been trained since childhood to find someone in a crowd, by looking at who was sitting alone and watching the door. She crossed the room without hesitating, sat down across from me, and said, "Hi." Just that. Hi. And I said, "Hi." And we looked at each other for a moment across a coffee shop table with 20 years of parallel life between us, and then we both laughed, the slightly overwhelmed, involuntary kind, and that was the beginning. We talked for 3.5 hours. I want to tell you about Lily because she is the part of this story that I did not expect, which is to say, she is the part that made everything else make sense in a way I couldn't have predicted from the outside. She is not what I was afraid she might be. I was afraid, and I am being honest about this because it matters, that she would be the family's center of gravity in the way that younger siblings sometimes are in families where resources and attention pool toward need. I was afraid she would be the reason for the redirected money in the present tense, not just in the past. I was afraid of the shape of the dynamic I was stepping into 20 years late. I was afraid the story wasn't over yet. What I found instead was a 26-year-old woman who had grown up knowing she was adopted, knowing her mother had died, knowing she had a sister somewhere who didn't know she existed, and who had spent the better part of her adolescence and young adulthood doing the particular internal work of someone who has been handed a complicated situation and has decided deliberately to build something real from it rather than something reactive. She was a second-grade teacher. She was funny in the dry, quiet way of people who have observed life carefully and found it more absurd than tragic. She was honest in a way that took me by surprise, immediately and without performance. She said, about 10 minutes into the conversation, "I want you to know that I've been angry about this too. Not at you, in the situation. I've wanted to know you for a long time, and I didn't have a way to make that happen without blowing up a lot of things for a lot of people. I kept waiting for them to find the right time, and eventually I understood that they were never going to find it on their own. I said, "How long have you known that?" She said, "Since I was about 16. I said, "And you waited anyway." She said, "I didn't know what else to do. They're my parents too. They're the only parents I've had since I was 6. I didn't want to blow their lives up. I just wanted a sister." I looked at her across the table. This woman, who had spent 10 years knowing she wanted something she couldn't have, chose not to take it by force because the cost to other people was too high. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of patience that comes from somewhere real. I said, "I'm sorry it took this long." She said, "It's not your fault." I said, "I know. I'm still sorry." She picked up her coffee cup, held it in both hands, and looked at me for a moment with an expression that I did not have a word for immediately. The closest I can get is recognition. The kind that happens when you see something you've been looking for a long time. She said, "I have a lot of questions about you." I said, "I have a lot of questions about you." She said, "Can we just start talking and see where it goes?" We did. We talked for 3.5 hours about her school and my firm, about the lake cabin in Michigan that apparently she had also been taken to in July, a different July from mine, the same cabin, which made us both pause. About her students, a few of whom she described with the specific warm exasperation of a teacher who is genuinely invested and knows it is making her slightly insane. About my engineering projects, which she was more curious about than most people, I appreciated immediately. About our parents. About what it had been like for her to grow up with the knowledge and for me to grow up without it. About what we both wanted now. At the end of the conversation, she asked if I wanted to exchange numbers. I said yes. She handed me her phone, and I put my number in, and she texted me immediately so I'd have hers. The text said, "Hi from the sister you didn't know about." I laughed. I saved her contact. We walked out onto the street in the November cold and hugged for the first time, which was the first time we had ever touched in 26 years of being related. And it was the kind of hug that makes you understand that some absences have been felt without being named. She said, "I'll text you." I said, "Please do." I drove home in the early dark of November. The city lights came up on the highway. I had the heat on and the radio off. And I drove in the particular silence of someone who has just had something rearranged inside them in a way that is not painful but is large. I thought about the 20 years. I thought about the parallel lives. I thought about my parents at their kitchen table, two people who had made a decision under pressure and then lived inside it for 20 years, and who were now going to have to live inside its consequences instead. I had not finished with my parents. The coffee shop had been for Lily. The reckoning with my parents was still ahead, and I had been giving it space to arrive at its own time. It arrived 3 weeks later. I asked them to come to me, to my city, my apartment, my table. It felt important that the conversation happen in my space rather than theirs, not as a power move, because I wanted to be on solid ground when I said what I needed to say. I wanted to be in the place I had built myself, from the inside out, on the resources I had actually had rather than the ones I had been told I had. They came on a Saturday. I made dinner. We ate first, which sounds strange but was actually right. We needed to be people at a table before we were people in a reckoning. We needed the ordinary before the hard. After dinner, I poured 3 glasses of water and sat down across from them and said, "I need to say some things. And I need you to hear them without interrupting or explaining until I'm done." They both nodded. My mother had her hands folded on the table. My father was in his upright, careful posture. I said, "I'm not here to end our relationship. I want to say that first because I don't want you to spend the next 20 minutes bracing for something that isn't coming. I love you both. That hasn't changed and isn't going to change." My mother exhaled. I said, "But I need you to understand the specific things that are true. Not approximately true. Specifically true. For 20 years, you kept a member of our family from me. Not a distant member. My sister. A person I was living in the same world with, going to the same lake cabin with, belonging to the same family with, who knew I existed and who I did not know existed. That is 20 years of a relationship I did not get to have. I can't recover those years. Neither can she. That is a real loss, and I need you to understand it as a real loss, not as an unavoidable consequence of a difficult situation. It was a consequence of a choice. My father said, "We know." I said, second, the money. $40,000 from a savings account you named after me and my future redirected without telling me. I worked 2 jobs in university because I thought the resources were thinner than I'd hoped. They were thinner than you'd told me. I'm not asking for the money back. I'm asking you to acknowledge that it happened and that I deserved to know it was happening. My mother said, "You're right. I'm sorry, Serena." My father said, "I'm sorry. Both of those things. We should have told you." About Lily from the beginning. About the money when it happened. We took the easy path both times, and the easy path compounded into something we didn't intend. I said, "I know you didn't intend it. I also know that 20 years is a long time to not find a better path." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "I've met Lily." My mother looked up. I said we had coffee 3 weeks ago. We talked for hours. She's remarkable. She's funny and honest, and she's been waiting a long time for this, and I think that's the saddest part of all of this to me. Not what I lost, what she carried. Knowing about me and not being able to reach me, that's on you. And I need you to understand that specifically. My mother was crying fully by this point. My father was not crying, but his face had the look of a man who is carrying something he understands, finally and fully, that he deserves to carry. I said, "Here is what I want going forward. I want an honest family, not a perfect one, not one where everything is repaired overnight, but one where the people in it know who they are to each other and are not managed and not handled and not protected from truths that belong to them. Lily is my sister. That is the truth. I want a relationship with her, and I want you to support that without making it complicated. I want to come home for the holidays and have her there. I want the 4 of us at the kitchen table. Not the 3 that it's been for 31 years. The 4 that it should have been from the beginning." My father said, "Yes." My mother said, "Yes." "Of course." "Yes." I said, "I also want to have a conversation about my grandmother's estate at some point. Not today. But her savings were distributed after she died, and I'd like to understand fully how that was handled. That's a separate conversation, and I'm not raising it as an accusation. I'm raising it because I am no longer willing to be managed around financial information that concerns me. I'm 31 years old, and I am a mechanical engineer who works in infrastructure, and I understand numbers, and I would like to be treated accordingly." My father looked at me for a moment with an expression I had seen only a few times in my life. It was the expression he wore when something impressed him enough to show. He said, "Fair enough." I said, "Okay, I think that's everything for tonight." We cleaned up the kitchen together. We talked about smaller things. Lily's school. My recent project. The Ohio State football season, which had been unremarkable. When they left, my father hugged me at the door for a long moment without saying anything. My mother held my face in her hands the way she had when I was small and said, "I'm so glad you came home." I said, "I'll always come home." Just without the secrets this time. Lily texted me that night. She must have been told I'd spoken to them. She sent a single message. "How did it go?" I sent it back. "We're going to be okay. All 4 of us." She sent back a single word. 4. And then, I've been waiting to say that for a long time. It has been 8 months since the dentist appointment. In that time, Lily and I have had 11 phone calls, 4 dinners, 1 overnight visit when she came to my city for a weekend, and we stayed up until 1 in the morning talking in my kitchen about everything and nothing. the way sisters apparently do when they have 20 years of catching up to fit into the time that's left. We went to the lake cabin in Michigan in July. All four of us, our parents, Lily, and I. It was the first July any of us had been there together. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it from childhood and completely different. And I sat on the dock one evening watching the water and thought about parallel lives and convergence and what it means when two things that were always supposed to be one thing finally arrive at the same place. My parents are in therapy. This was their decision, which I respect. My mother told me in September, almost in passing during a phone call, and I said I was glad. My father sent me an email 2 weeks later that said simply, "We should have done this years ago." I agree. I want to talk to you directly now. I am not telling you this story so you will be angry at my parents. They made a decision in a crisis, and then they kept making it, which is the way with decisions you don't revisit. I understand why they did what they did, and I also hold them accountable for the cost of it. And those two things coexist in me without contradiction, because that is what it means to love complicated people in complicated situations. I am telling you this story because some of you are living inside a shape that has been handed to you without your knowledge. A family structure built around something you haven't been told. A financial arrangement that doesn't match what you've been given to understand. A sibling or a half-sibling or a cousin who is closer than you've been led to believe. A history that has been simplified for your comfort in ways that have cost you something real. And you don't know how to look for it because you don't know it's there. The form at the dentist's was random. It could have been anything. It could have been nothing. I could have skipped the siblings field and typed none and driven home and lived my 32nd year and my 33rd without ever knowing Lily existed. The thought of that is the one that still catches in my chest when I sit with it too long. Not the money, not the years. The possibility of Lily in Columbus teaching second graders and waiting, and me never showing up. Look at the form. Fill in the field. Ask the question you've been almost asking. The answer might be nothing. Or it might be a name you've never heard attached to a life that has been running parallel to yours, waiting to converge. That is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Tell me if there is something in your family you've been almost asking about and haven't yet. I read every single one. Subscribe to the next story every week, and check the description for another one I think you'll connect with. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know.